So here we are. This is a cyanobacterium. It is actually green because it's photosynthetic. It was probably something like this that was the ancestor of, well, certainly of all plants, but one of the first things out there. We've got fossils from probably 3.5 billion years ago that look kind of like this, made mats, and they still do. Now, this is staph. You guys probably know about staph because you can get staph infections. E. coli, sometimes it causes problems with humans. We also have a lot of E. coli in our guts. And then you can see from, this is kind of like to scale, so viruses are generally tiny, except for some new ones they found that are fairly large. And then here we have a eukaryotic cell. So eukaryotes are generally, they have the biggest cells. But as I mentioned, there's some viruses now that are about the size of a small bacteria. And viruses, of course, well, they're not really considered living because they don't have their own metabolism. But I think that's wrong myself. What they do is, of course, they're the perfect parasites. They insert their DNA into another cell and get the cell to make more viral particles. But they found some new viruses that are called megaviruses that are just about the size of a small bacterium, and they actually have partial metabolic processes where they have genes that make things on their own. Hold on one second. Okay. So this is kind of what a bacteria or archaea looks like. If we get this larger. So this is the inside. No, that's not very good. Come on. That's the inside of the cell. This is the outside of the cell. This is kind of a membrane protein. Here's some cholesterol. This is a membrane protein for actually letting things in and outside of the cell. On the outside, it's hydrophilic. Now, hydrophilic means water-loving. And then you have these you have these plasma membrane right here, and on the inside this is a phospholipid bilayer, and lipids are fats, and so they're not water soluble. So what allows to happen is that there's this barrier between the outside and the inside, and then they've got these sorts of proteins that allow things inside and outside of the cell. Now, as I mentioned, bacteria and archaea versus eukarya. It says prokaryotes up there. I want you to get rid of that notion from your mind. Prokaryotes were everything that didn't have a nucleus, hence bacteria and archaea. But bacteria and archaea are really very different from each other. In fact, like I said, we're more closely related to archaea than we are to either bacteria. So they used to call it prokaryotes because they didn't have an organelle, they didn't have a nucleus. Now we just call them bacteria and archaea. Now they don't have any subcellular compartments. Here's a bacteria. A lot of them have flagella. Here's all the chromosomes. In other words, no nucleus. The cytoplasm, there's ribosomes for making protein, cell wall, some membrane. Okay, now we go here. And this is a eukaryotic cell. There's a lot more stuff going on. First of all, there's a nucleus. This is where the DNA is. Let's see here. Okay, so nucleus. Outside of ribosomes, like in the bacterium, and what they do is they translate the instructions that are in RNA into proteins. And then there's also these things called mitochondria, and they are the powerhouses of the cells. That means glucose is used by them to turn glucose into energy that the cell can actually use. Now, it turns out that mitochondria are actually originally a type of bacteria. You wonder, well, how did it get in there? Well, it's either thought that a eukaryotic cell either engulfed the bacteria or the bacteria was kind of like a parasite. And then over the years, many billions of years, they became obligate. So a eukaryotic cell can't do without mitochondria, and mitochondria can't do without an individual cell. So this is what's called a symbiotic relationship in a sense. It started out as two separate organisms, and now they're all part of one. It turns out that mitochondria even have their own DNA. Now, if you looked at a plant cell, you would see a lot of the same stuff, but you would also see chloroplasts. And chloroplasts are used photosynthetically to make sugars, to make energy compounds that plants use, and are basically the basis for all the whole food chain. Those got in there in the same way as the mitochondria. They were a cyanobacterium, and they were probably engulfed by a eukaryotic cell, and that's one of the lineages that led to plants. So that they are actually photosynthetic. They can make their own food. There's also these other things that are in here. We won't go into them at this point, but you can see that there's a lot going on there. Okay. Now, what makes different cell types different? All cells contain the same genes, but can use different sets of genes to develop into different cell types. That means that in each nucleus, we have the whole genome of the organism. So for this cell, there's the whole genome is inside that nucleus in the form of chromosomes. In our cells, each one of our cells has our whole genome inside it, can make every sort of protein that's necessary. But of course, there are different cell types, and so different genes turn on and off depending on what cell type it is. There are also some basic housekeeping genes that basically work in all cells. So, proteins, genes make up proteins. Proteins do everything in our body. Excuse me. They're signaling proteins that kind of coordinate cell activity. They're transport proteins to move things inside and outside the nucleus, inside and outside the cell. They're skeletal proteins. Well, they're actually proteins that give cells their shape. Antibody proteins provide immune defenses. Receptor proteins receive signals. Enzymes catalyze chemical reactions and allow metabolism. Hormones are proteins. So anytime you see ACE on something, that means it's an enzyme. In terms of alcohol dehydrogenase, that means it's a protein, it's an enzyme that breaks down alcohol. This is what goes on in your liver when you drink, breaks down alcohol. Lactase is an enzyme that breaks down into lactose. Anybody know what lactase is? Milk, exactly. So dairy products. We'll get into this more later, but mammals are the only organisms that produce milk. In virtually all mammals, except for humans, they produce milk for babies, and then when the babies are weaned, they don't produce any more milk. And so they don't produce any more lactase. In other words, adult animals are pretty much lactose intolerant. So, it turns out that humans, of course, some humans can actually use milk products. And that's because there's been about 3 different or 4 different mutations where lactose tolerance evolved independently. So Northern Europe, most people, Northern Europeans are lactose tolerant. A lot of people in the Middle East, anywhere where you have a pastoral culture, like animals like goats and sheep and things like that. That's pretty much where this kind of mutation arose. Arose, just by random chance, and there was one individual who could drink milk, and it was getting desperate. There wasn't a lot of food, and lo and behold, he decided to drink milk. The other ones tried to drink milk, but they didn't. They had upset stomach. He survived, and it was passed down to future generations. Now, DNA polymerase is one of those enzymes that's found that works in every cell because it's part of the replication process for chromosomes. Okay. This is activation energy. And goes from 0 to 100. And normally you might have a chemical reaction where you need this much energy up to here to get it to move. Well, An enzyme allows that reaction to happen at much lower activation energy, so it becomes much more efficient. So oftentimes you'll have these chemical reactions that need a lot of energy, but you'll have a whole string of, let's say, enzymes in the pathway that lower that activation energy, and the reactions can proceed much more easily. Okay, so ASC is enzymes. Proteins are actually polymers. That means they're long chains, and they're long chains of amino acids. So, here is a kind of a general formula for an amino acid. Got oxygens, let me get it even bigger. Hydroxyl, a bunch of hydrogens tacked on. This is the amine group. It always has nitrogen in it, a side group, a carboxyl group. So that's the basic structure of what a protein looks like. Or what a protein is made of. Let's put it that way. So proteins are made of long strings of amino acids. And here you see 3 different amino acids: valine, alanine, and phenylalanine. These are the 3 of the amino acids out of the 20 that all life on Earth uses. And then there's this peptide bond right here that's kind of stringing things together. And then here we have a long string of amino acids, and this is a protein, and it's folded in a certain way. So not only do you have a protein made, but it has to be folded in the right way so that it can do its work, and it can, there are certain active sites. So if you have, let's say, a mutation in the DNA, and it gets transferred and then translated into a protein, and it's a mutation, it can maybe have no effect, maybe have a good effect, most likely it's going to have a bad effect. Proteins are the source of building blocks for proteins. Now, it shows here what we got. We've got a steak, pretty thin steak, not worth a damn, salmon, nuts, cheese, all this stuff. There's no green here. In other words, where's the plants? Well, plants are full of protein too. Remember, DNA only is used to translate things into proteins. And proteins are long strings of amino acids. So plants use proteins just like everyone else. They use different proteins, but they still use proteins. What they what plants do actually is they take carbon dioxide and sunlight, they use the energy from sunlight, and they turn it into sugars as a food source. So there's some amino acids that we make in our bodies. But there's some we actually have to eat that we have to find elsewhere. So amino acids that can't make that we can't make in our bodies or cells can't make are called essential amino acids. And here's a list of them. It turns out that we can make 13 of 20 non-essential amino acids. In other words, we don't have to go out and eat something to provide them. And then there's these others that are essential amino acids. There's about 7. And all told, there's 20 amino acids that life uses. And then, okay, so these are essential. We have to go out and get them. These are conditionally essential. In other words, there will be some situations where we can't get enough of them, and we have to go outside and get them in our diet. Okay. Who gets sleepy when they eat turkey dinner at Thanksgiving? Okay. Now, we can turn it into a question. Why do we get sleepy when we eat turkey? And we'll come up with a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that turkey has a lot of tryptophan, and tryptophan is used to make serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter, a hormone, that affects sleep. And so you eat a lot of tryptophan, hence you should go to sleep. And that turkey, in fact, the prediction is, so we're going from hypothesis, tryptophan causes sleepiness because of the serotonin pathway. And we make the prediction that foods that are high in tryptophan should make you go to sleep. And so we should make a prediction that, let's say turkey should have a high percentage or a high proportion of tryptophan, probably higher than anything else. So we can actually test this, can't we? Just like we test any hypothesis. We test the prediction. We can do some chemical analysis. Here we go. This is a table of percent protein, tryptophan in terms of grams, or grams per 100 grams of food, and then percent tryptophan. Spirulina is 1.62. Soybeans are 1.62. They're pretty high. Pumpkin seeds, where are, let's see, pork chop is 1.27. Where are my, caribou's good, 1.55. Where is my turkey? There it is, turkey, 1.11. We just falsified the hypothesis. What's another explanation for why we might feel sleepy after a big turkey dinner? Anybody? Yeah?
Probably focusing more energy on digestion.
So I just said kind of a giveaway, a big turkey dinner. When you have eaten a big dinner like that, there's a lot of energy going into digestion. You kind of just want to sit back and just fade away. So it turns out that you can eat as much turkey as you want if you don't eat everything else, and you probably won't get sleepy. So this is what we just went through. So vitamins, everybody needs vitamins. They act as cofactors for enzymes. So they're coenzymes, and they help enzymes do their work. So these are all essential. We can't get vitamins on our own. We have to find them in our food, except for vitamin D. You can get vitamin D by going out in the sunshine, and then our bodies actually produce vitamin D. So vitamin D is a conditional vitamin, just because we can synthesize some of it. If you're in a place where there isn't much sunlight, you're probably going to be deficient in vitamin D. Okay. So vitamin C, anybody in here take vitamin C? Yeah, for what? Just in general?
So I don't get sick.
Okay. Hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else in here take vitamin C when they've got a cold or anything? Okay. Just so you know, it doesn't do any good. But in the past, British sailors would go on long voyages. They were oftentimes pressed in the service, in other words, down by the docks. Some military guy would go along, collar guy, and throw them in the hold in the ship, and off they'd go. They didn't have a lot of food that was good. It was mainly hardtack and salt pork. Forever and ever and ever. It turns out that if you don't have any vitamin C, you get a disease that's caused by vitamin deficiency, which is called scurvy. And your teeth start to fall out. Collagen is the connective tissue. Your skin kind of becomes, it's just, you're falling apart. There are other diseases where there's vitamin deficiency, like rickets is another one. Some actually, in terms of minerals, act as cofactors, like iron for hemoglobin. So hemoglobin in red blood cells carries oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the body, because all the cells need oxygen to perform their functions. And iron is very, well, it binds very heavily or strongly to oxygen. And then it also binds fairly heavily to CO2, carbon dioxide. So of course it goes in, goes in the lungs, gets oxygen, carries it around, gets CO2, brings it out, and expels it. There's a whole bunch of other kind of minerals that we need. We need manganese. Plus means it's missing 2 electrons, so it's an ion. Potassium is K. Let's see, that's Cl. It's a chloride ion. It's -1. So some minerals are kind of important for bone formation, like calcium, phosphorus, all that kind of stuff. All the minerals that you have come from your diet. Okay. Anybody ever hear of antioxidants before? Okay. What they do is they neutralize part of the metabolism of the cell called free radicals. And free radicals are highly reactive chemicals. Anything usually with chlorine, chlorines often make free radicals. And supposedly, they can do a lot of destruction inside of the cell. And so antioxidants kind of bind to them and stop them from doing that. And so a lot of things that you see that are like supplements will say antioxidant. And that's good. There's actually it's theoretical that, that antioxidants work on free radicals. But there's no real evidence that necessarily that free radicals cause problems in the cell, even though they're highly reactive. So antioxidants are one of those things that it's a big selling point now. Of course, you can also get a lot from just natural food like blueberries. Oh, I know what it was. So, fats, one of my favorite things. You ever ever walk by where someone's frying food?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Now, some people hate that, but some people, you know, it gets you all going. You kind of want to have some of that. Now, there's different kinds of fats, but kind of fats are essential for some of the things that we need, especially for the cellular membrane that I mentioned before. In our evolutionary history, we rarely came across food that was really, really, really high in fat content. A lot of the animals that were killed to eat for food were servants, which are pretty lean meat, like deer and elk and things like that. Occasionally, we might have found something that was really high in fats. One thing that's good is grubs. Insect larvae, they're pretty much just full of fat. They're really good. Butter and garlic. I swear, it's really good. And there were some animals that you could eat that were also high in fat content. But fat, in the past, whenever humans came upon it, it was a rarity and it was a treat, and you pretty much ate all that you could, period. Because, of course, famines are the biggest problem when you're, let's say, a hunter-gatherer or you have basic agriculture, and you might have the crops fail. Now, as I mentioned, there's also fats that are a lot of plant fats, like they're polyunsaturated, like olive oil. And we store fats because it's the best way to actually store energy. We also store some stuff in carbohydrates, but fat, pound for pound, has much more energy stored that we can then break down and turn into energy for our cells. Now, I mentioned, of course, that we use fatty acids for diet, storing energy, but we also use them in our cells directly. So we can synthesize essentially most fatty acids. And here's a here's a cell. This is outside the cell. This is inside the cell. This is the phospholipid bilayer. So if we really focus in on this. Okay. This is the phospholipid bilayer. Let's see something a little bit better. Okay. Lipids are fats. They're essential in terms of cells because since they're hydrophobic, that means they're not water-loving, they actually keep the outside of the cell out and the inside of the cell in. And so, of course, this is one of the reasons that we actually need fats as well. Oh yeah, so this is, again, the fatty acid or lipid bilayer right here. Okay. So what do you think fats or fatty acids are? What do we call those that we can't make from scratch, do you think? Think about vitamins or amino acids. Essential, non-essential. Now, fatty acids come in different forms. Saturated fats on the top there. They have these nice straight chain carbons with hydrogen on either side, and then what is that called on the other side? Hydroxyl. And most animal fats are like that, and so they're actually at room temperature. They're solid. Unsaturated fats are different, and so they don't have that same structure, so they're usually liquid at room temperature. Okay. So most plant fats are unsaturated. And it was thought that, well, they all say that eating or cooking with olive oil is a good way to get that stuff, and it is. I mean, I cook with it all the time because it tastes good. Oh, and then you can make an unsaturated fat, like a vegetable oil, and turn it into a saturated fat by adding hydrogens to it. So you end up with margarine. Now, for the longest time, it was said that you shouldn't eat animal fats, that it will clog up your arteries with cholesterol. Cholesterol is kind of a fat-like molecule. We get cholesterol from our food and from our liver, which manufactures it. And there was a point, about 10 years ago, where it was suggested a low-fat diet was the best thing for you. Well, it turns out that's not true. Recently, now there hasn't been a whole lot of research on it, but they've had some. It shows, in fact, that a high-fat diet, or a diet rich in fats, is not bad for you. It turns out that you would think, well, doesn't that add cholesterol into your blood, or it causes cardiovascular disease? It turns out dietary cholesterol does not significantly increase your circulating cholesterol in your blood. It's almost entirely from your liver. So, certainly with unsaturated fats, you can have as much as you want. In fact, they're good for you. We're still out on whether animal fats are terrible for you or not that bad for you or okay. So they're telling you with animal fats, treat them like you did in the past. But a lot of our diet now that we used to think was bad is actually good, and vice versa. So there was a movie called, I meant to put that in there. I'll not find it later. Woody Allen, he was in a movie called Sleepers, and he's been cryogenically frozen and reanimated like 100 years later. And he used to live in the East Village, like he does, and he used to eat all organic. No fats, nothing like that. Just all good macrobiotic diet. And so the guys that were doing a workup on him after he woke up, they, remarked on what he had in his body and stuff. And one of them said, well, actually in those days they used to think that like steak was really, really bad for you. We now know, of course, that steak is essential and you should eat as much of it as you possibly can. So if you want to go and eat a ribeye, go ahead. Okay, so again, this is really recent stuff. Saturated fats, the jury's out on that. Certainly, olive oil and mackerel and seafood and avocado, those are unsaturated fats. They certainly are good for you. So here we are with cholesterol, and this is old. I left it in here because it's more recent stuff. Cholesterol is part of a steroid hormone. And it's not water soluble, and it generally gets carried around in the bloodstream and might cause plaques that then cause cardiovascular disease. But it turns out that it's really not caused by excess fats in your diet. Now, they usually give you a cholesterol test when you get older. They want to keep you less than 200 parts per milligram, I think, or microgram. Most of the we get is from the liver. There are two different forms of cholesterols, HDL, and which is actually a good form. So, and then LDL, which is triglycerides, which actually kind of deposit cholesterol on the artery walls. Then, of course, there's carbohydrates. Most of the carbs we get are from plants. This is what plants make when they turn sunlight and carbon dioxide into food. They make carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates like sugar, complex carbs like potatoes and sweet potatoes. Brussels sprouts have complex carbs, but they're actually fiber, and we don't really digest fiber very well, so it usually just goes right kind of through us. So I'm made of carbon and hydrate. So it's always a multiple of the number of carbons and the number of oxygens that make up a carbohydrate. Our body needs glucose, and we can also use fructose in the same way, the monosaccharide. It's just a single carbohydrate. And that's what, when we eat like complex carbs, our body actually breaks those down into glucose for the most part. And then we also have sucrose, which is table sugar. It's a disaccharide. And then these polysaccharides, like starch, that you found in potatoes and things like that. And you can see there's long chains. So you can have very, very long chains that these bonds, when they're broken, they actually release energy. Okay. Now, starch can be broken down. Cellulose can. In fact, there's no mammal that can actually break down cellulose, but you think, well, cows eat grass. How come they can do it? Well, they have a whole bunch of bacteria and other things like fungi and things like that in their guts that actually break down the cellulose. So the bacteria break it down. The cows get to use the energy. Bacteria also get to live in an environment that, well, you might sound like you wouldn't want to live in a cow's gut, but for them it's great. So things like Brussels sprouts is cellulose, something that we really can't break down. Very little of it, and most of it is fiber, dietary fiber. So it's actually good for you. Having a lot of dietary fiber in your diet reduces, colon cancer, things like that. So this is kind of what the cellulose is on top. Salud. The starch is in the bottom. Now, of course, plants also, some plants make fruit. That's so that the fruit attracts someone to come along, eat it, and then poop out the seeds. It's a seed dispersal mechanism. But fruit, of course, mainly has fructose, which is a monosaccharide. And that's hence why it's sweet. So here's the dietary fiber. I've kind of mentioned it already, that symbiotic bacteria living in the digestive tract can actually break down cellulose. Termites are famous for, obviously, take wood. That's a carbohydrate. It's cellulose, and they can actually break it down for food. Now, you can imagine eating, let's say, a lot of carbohydrates. A huge plate of pasta. Well, you're only going to use so much of it at once in terms of fuel for the mitochondria. But what do you do with the rest? Well, most of it is then converted into glycogen and stored in the liver. So each gram of stored glycogen is bound by 3 grams of water. Now, this is interesting. There are a lot of desert animals. In the desert, there's not much water. There's certainly very little free water, whether it's in the diet or free water just standing. And it turns out some animals actually rely entirely on glycogen for their water, because when they use it, it produces 3 grams of water that's actually bound to a glycogen molecule. Okay? Each gram of glycogen is 3 grams of water. So like kangaroo rats never have to drink, ever. Their seeds that they eat will have a little bit of water in it, but they can rely entirely on glycogen stores that then give it all of this water. So our brain can only use carbohydrates. And when we exercise and start burning calories, aside from carbohydrates that we eat that are simple carbohydrates like fructose, we go immediately for glycogen that's stored in our liver. And when that's all gone, then we start actually breaking down protein, which isn't good. So there's 2 different kinds of metabolism, anabolic where you're building up a synthesis of muscle, storage of fat. So you turn carbohydrates into fat. You have protein that you need for your muscles to build up. And then catabolic, in other words, breaking things down. And usually when you break things down, you're breaking these chemical bonds that release energy. So the first thing that goes, that we break down, are glycogen and fats usage, which are under aerobic conditions. That means it requires oxygen for the chemical reaction, but it gives you a great deal of an energy molecule called ATP that we'll deal with in just a second. And then you can also break down muscle for energy, but it's usually because of unfavorable circumstances where you don't have enough food. Okay. Let's see. I think you guys probably already know that. Oops. Look at that. Let's see how long it lasts. Okay. So, we all know what insulin is. Insulin is a hormone. It's made by the pancreas. And we actually look at this. There we go. Okay. So here we have glucose. So we start with insulin here, an insulin receptor. You have to go through an intermediate step called pyruvate and turn that into, and then the glucose transporter imports the glucose. It also takes the glycogen. So insulin binds to this receptor, which is the main thing that happens. Now, there's a couple of diseases that are associated with a lack of insulin. Okay. Enough eating for now. One is type 2 diabetes. And number two is type 1 diabetes and type 2. I think we're going to get to that, but the first one is caused by an autoimmune disease. It requires insulin because your body doesn't make it anymore. Type 2 is the kind that most of you hear about from diet. Yeah?
Is there a way you could zoom out so I could read what was before that?
Sure. So metabolic rate, obviously body weight, activity level, genetic makeup, ecology and evolution. Now, I know that we're done with ecology at this point. I mean, we're done with evolution, but I want you guys to think back to the last test. What do you think our ancestors What was their diet like, do you think?
They like nuts, berries, just whatever they could have.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you think it was a good diet?
Yes and no.
Yes and no. Okay. Yes. In what way?
Because it was like the stuff they would find, like the nuts and berries, like the organic stuff,
Uh-huh.
was like processed.
Yeah,
But
that's
then
true.
no in a way, because like if they killed like an animal, like I don't know how they ate it or what parts they ate.
Oh, they had fire.
But like like
Yeah.
did they eat it? No, I know like they cooked it, but
Oh.
I'm saying like
Yeah. Usually
the way they ate it.
No, usually they sliced it open, ate the liver right away. No, it's really full of great stuff. It is. I mean, you might not like it, but that's what they did. And they pretty much used the whole animal. Obviously, the hide they use for, clothing and stuff like that. Yeah. So, obviously, it turns out, you get much more calories gathering than you do hunting, it turns out. Hunting is a really expensive enterprise. And in fact, if the tribe or the group spent all their time gathering, they'd get a lot more calories. But hunting is a way, actually, it's sexual selection. Like a good hunter gets a good wife. It's a status symbol. Not everybody can be a good hunter. You're either good or you're not so good. And so meat became obviously part of the diet. A lot of hunter-gatherers, they ate pretty well, and they didn't have to spend all that much time. Early agriculture was actually, people tended to have a less diverse, kind of a worse diet in a sense. Now, the thing is, though, do you think it was always throughout the year like that in terms of the food? Yeah.
Because of the season.
Mm-hmm. So, there's always going to be part of the year where there's less food around. Some years there might be an extensive famine, like the drought in California right now. And there's going to be a limit on the food supply. And metabolism plays a huge role in that. Because let's say you're really good, you have a very efficient metabolic rate, you never put on any fat, you're in great shape. And then there's old Joe over here. And whenever there's a large amount of food, he'll eat all he can and he starts putting on a little weight. If he's lucky enough to get a large amount of carbs, like let's say, or something, but, honey. Let's say they got a lot of honey, they're going to glom that up, they're going to eat it like crazy. But what do you think is going to happen if, let's say, there's a famine? Compared to, what's his name again? Who did I say was a little tubby? I forget. Anyway, there's a skinny guy, there's a little fat guy. Women generally have more body fat than men because of reproduction. And who do you think is going to survive the best during the famine?
Women?
So, do you think the skinny guy or the fat guy is going to survive better? Okay. In other words, he's got a metabolic rate that's not as efficient. He doesn't have that nice body. Who's going to leave more genes in the future after that famine? Yeah. So, one of the reasons that that's been suggested in terms of a hypothesis for type 2 diabetes is that this is a holdover when our environment didn't have unlimited supply of food. This also included, of course, agriculturalists, a famine, crops failed, die, right? So people that could actually put on weight and use that excess fat to get them through the hard times are going to be actually favored. They're going to have a higher fitness than all the others. So that is probably, now, if you take that person, or both those people, the skinny one and the tubby one, and you put them in a food environment that's really, really rich, in other words, there's never a lack of food. The slow metabolism gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's just doing what his body, was favored. The skinny one doesn't. He's just Jim Dandy, and the other one, of course, gets all these metabolic problems with metabolism, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, a slew of things. So you have to really think about, in terms of metabolic rate and food supply, you have to think about it in terms of evolutionary terms. And why people today, a lot of people who get type 2 diabetes, they had a phenotype that 10,000 years ago or less was absolutely perfect for using calories slowly and surviving famine. Okay, so that's what I just said. There he is. Now, in our food environment also, there's certain things we really like. I mentioned earlier fatty stuff and really sweet stuff, like honey. And whenever we find those things, we love them. It's really kind of a holdover from our past, because we usually didn't find a big bunch of fatty food, nor did we find a bunch of sweets. We might get into a berry patch that's pretty good, but like honey, let's say, it's not very common. So when we come across those kinds of things nowadays, our bodies naturally respond to it. Because back then, you wanted to get as much of that stuff as possible. It meant that you survived, the other ones didn't. So, like I mentioned, type 1 is a metabolic autoimmune disorder. That means an autoimmune, it means that essentially the body, the immune system attacks itself. In this case, it destroys the beta cells. There are many, many, many autoimmune disorders. Multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis. There's someone that I think attacks the eyes. It's just amazing how many. And there seems to be an incidence in terms of rising incidence of these autoimmune disorders, and I'm going to get to why that might be. Part of the problem with type 2 diabetes or type 1 is that you have back circulatory problems, so you end up with end-stage kidney disease, heart disease, and a lot of people go blind. Now, type 2 is the kind I was just talking about. It's a holdover from our evolutionary history when we had an uneven food supply. So they did a study with rats, probably 10, 15 years ago. And they had a rat model of diabetes. So if you put a rat on a normal diet, it will put on weight. And it get really chubby, really, I mean, just loaded with fat. And then they had their regular model that efficiently burns up all the calories that they eat. And they put these two types of rats, a pair, let's say 20 of each, one in an environment where there wasn't much food. The diet was rather, bad. First they put all of them in a simple environment where they've been eating food. Then they put the ones on a bad diet, and they put the others on a good diet. So, the ones on the good diet, the ones without the diabetic mouse, they're fine, they're happy. They run on a little treadmill as fast as they possibly can. The other ones get really, really, really fat. They don't run so well on that treadmill. And then the other ones, in the bad food environment, kind of simulating semi-famine, the fat ones aren't fat anymore, so they survive. The other ones are either in very poor condition, or they just don't survive at all. Okay? So you can see how these metabolic processes that vary between individuals, we're talking about variation, how some might be actually favored in certain environments and not others. Okay, now another thing that's kind of interesting, here, I just need one more. Anybody in here can't drink your milk? Well, I talked about earlier, I mentioned the lactase, which is an enzyme that breaks down lactose, which is found in dairy products. And it breaks the lactose down into glucose and galactose. Now, there's only certain groups of humans that actually have an ability to metabolize milk, digest it. Northern Europeans, Central Middle Easterners, and then a number of different groups in Africa. And it turns out that there's a mutation that upstream, so the gene that makes galactase is the same, but upstream there's a control gene that if it's on, you produce lactase to break down milk. If you don't, if it's off, then you don't. Well, there's a mutation that left it on in, let's say, an individual, and just making, for most mammals, making extra lactase is a waste, right? Because they're never going to have milk or milk products after they are little and they've been weaned. But this individual, let's say, had it, and he passed it on, because you can imagine being able to digest milk compared to someone who's not, you're probably going to have higher fitness. Because it's a food source that you can utilize and no one else can. And wherever, like Middle East and Northern Europeans, wherever there was a pastoral or a dairy culture where they had animals that made milk, you end up with people who can digest milk products. East Asians, for the most part, didn't have a dairying culture until much later, and Native Americans. So both of those groups are kind of underrepresented in terms of people who can actually digest milk or not. Obviously, there's a lot of gene flow now, so that's changing, but this is where you see things like this happening. It turns out the African populations that are lactose tolerant, each group had a different mutation, but that both mutations, they kept the gene for lactase on. And so that's, once it happens, you know, it's passed on to the next generation if it's favored. So that's why humans can actually drink milk. Some of them can, some of them can't. Of course, they can all drink milk when they're little. So here's our lactose gene. It's attached to a galactose. This is, lactose, sugar. So lactose is a sugar. And then lactase is an enzyme. And what happens is, there's these active sites on this enzyme. The protein is folded in a certain way, and active sites attached to the lactose, and also that the lactose is part of it. And then, after it's released, you have these two things. You have glucose and galactose. And, for example, also, if you have, let's say, sucrose, which is a disaccharide, you get both of them. So this is what the enzyme does. It actually helps you break down milk products so that you can turn them into useful products. So we start, let's see, where is it? Okay. We'll say those are glucose molecules that have been taken into the cell. And there's an enzyme that breaks them down. There's a whole kind of cascade of pathways. Eventually, glucose is then turned into ATP. Now, ADP is an intermediate product. ATP is basically the currency, the energy currency of all cells. You really can't do much of anything without ATP. You can't store ATP. When you have ATP, you have to use it immediately. That's why you store glycogen and you store fats and things like that. In some reactions that are, let's say, anaerobic, that means without oxygen, like the fermentation pathway, you get, I think, 1 or 2 ATP molecules per glucose molecule. In an aerobic reaction, which is the Krebs cycle, with this whole electron transport chain, you get 36 or 38 ATPs. And you only get those if you actually have mitochondria to do the work. So without ATP, ATP runs everything. So this is glucose metabolism. We start with glucose. We have oxygen. We end up with CO2, water, and HTP. When you do it without oxygen, you get what's called the glycolysis pathway. And here you get 36 to 38 ATPs. And here you get, I think 2. So every time you break down glucose, you're going to at least get 2, but it's not a very efficient pathway. And it's all because eukaryotic cells have mitochondria. So bacteria can't use the Krebs cycle. Only eukaryotic cells can. And they use the mitochondria, which is our old symbiont bacteria that was incorporated into the original eukaryotic cell. So you can also break down, of course, fatty acids. Fatty acids, fats are, let's say, pound for pound, the best way to store energy. You can store because of the carbon bonds compared to carbohydrates or glycogen. Now, if you start exercising, the first thing you're going to break down are your glycogen stores and your fat stores. And after that, you start to break down what's called your protein. So, also, like people who've been, let's say, a long run, they get, they've used up all their oxygen. I mean, they're still bringing in oxygen, but not enough. They get a buildup of lactic acid, which is actually a part of muscle protein. And because there's nothing left, but breaking down muscle protein is expensive and you don't get that much out of it. So this is all under aerobic conditions. That means with oxygen. So when you break down glucose, you can only do glucose or something like it, and you either do it through the fermentation process or glycolysis. So if you've exercised really hard, you've depleted all your glycogen and your fatty acids, and the only thing you have left is the protein in your body. Now, the same thing actually happens with diabetics. They have enough food, they have enough oxygen, but type 2 diabetics, instead of not making enough insulin, their cells become insulin resistant. And so they're not actually getting any glucose into the cells, and you have all this free-floating glucose, which is bad for the body. And then the body, usually diabetics in the beginning, start to lose weight. And they think, God, my diet's going great. And then they find out that that's not the case. So we use calorie as a measurement of the amount of glucose that's needed to turn, I think, 1 gram of water up 1 degree. So extra calories are stored as fat. 1 pound of carbohydrates, you're not going to get 3,500 calories. 1 pound of fat, you can. Now, these are called actually kilocalories. In other words, what we've referred to in this is kilocalories. That means 1,000 calories versus 1. So if you ever look at the food label, the big C, they're referring to kilocalories and not single calories. So body fat index. This is the amount of fat to your body weight. And there's usually kind of a healthy range of BMI between 20 and 25. Individuals who are 30 or above have unhealthy BMIs. It's not the same as percent body fat. It's correlated, but it's not the same. It also takes into account muscle mass, which weighs a lot more than fat. This?
The body fat increase. Okay.
Okay. Have a period all the time, so women are always receptive sexually. I don't mean they're always ready to have sex, but they can. And then pregnancy is really expensive, and then once they're born, lactation is even more expensive. You need huge amounts of food and fat stores to be able to raise a kid from being an infant to the point where they're weaned. And before they're weaned, of course, they're drinking milk. Milk is expensive to make. So women generally have between 12 and 31, men 5 and 25. Women marathon runners, or any women who exercise a lot of times their BMI is really low and their menstrual cycle stops. In India, different than Africa, it turns out women are low on the totem pole in a family where usually the woman goes and lives with her husband's family. In other words, the mother-in-law. Mother-in-law is usually kind of at the top. Her son gets all the food, and then the woman gets table scraps. And it turns out that a lot of women who are basically the wives, right, they have such a poor diet that when they get pregnant, if they do, they often end up with underweight babies that die or die in childbirth or beforehand because they're underweight. They're starting to try to change that. It turns out it's not the same sort of culture in Africa, even though there's often less food in Africa.
You can go back.
There's a bunch of ways to measure body fat. You can use the mechanical thing, hydrostatic weighing. But that's basically the range of BMI. So this is, let's see. Okay, building muscles. You actually have to stress the muscles that you have. You actually break them down a little bit. You also need amino acids to then rebuild the muscle protein. And then, of course, you need the anabolic reactions, in other words, putting things together into new protein that requires ATP. It turns out that if you're trying to lose weight and trying to put on muscle at the same time, you can't do it. You have to do one or the other. Either burn fat or build up muscle. Okay, so if I look, this is a myth, if I lift heavy weights, I might look like that, or if I'm lifting light weights for many reps because I just want to tone. Okay. Muscle tone is actually a product of two things: how much muscle there is and how much fat on the top. Anybody here work out to get nice muscle tone? Okay, you're all slumped. Oh, there you go. It's better. So you can build muscle primarily by using heavy weights, which you need for amino acids, calories, and heavy weights to build muscle. You can lose fat by eating fewer calories and exercising. Boy, that was fast. Good.